I'm here with Tony Hodge, the former president and CEO of the International Council on Mining and Metals. He is here at the Sustainable Minerals Institute. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you very, very much.
So I wanted to start by saying this is the second opportunity I've had to talk with you about this topic. The first was in a cafe in London in 2013. At the time, I was interviewing change makers for a book I was writing on the legacy of the Mining, Minerals and Sustainable Development Project, the MMSD. And now we're here in Brisbane. You've spent the last 3 months as a resident scholar at the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. I wanted to start by taking us back to the late 1990s. What was different at that time about the mining industry's relationship with society? And at the time, you relayed a story to me about a mining CEO who I think his daughter had been caught in a photo in a newspaper protesting against mining. So it kind of signifies a different time. So yeah, what can you tell us about that period? What's different to now?
Many, many different things, but relevant to the Sustainable Minerals Institute and the conversation we're having here relative to what was going on then. The mining industry had found itself at that point in time really stuck between many rocks and many hard places simultaneously. Because not only had the contemporary environmental movement risen to a crest in the 80s and peaked through the 90s, they had gained a capacity to articulate their concerns. In fact, the civil society organizations of that day, I would argue, maybe got on to the use of social media quicker than the corporate sector. They came to see its power. They were using it and drawing public attention to mining operations that had been shown to, in fact, cause in certain cases significant amount of harm to the environment and to host communities. They are objecting to that. They wanted change. So they were the harbingers. They were the troubadours that were telling of things to come. But simultaneously, that wasn't the only thing going on. What happened in the 90s, if you recall also, is that the dot-com phenomena occurred. The investor community got drawn into this. The investor community, with all of this public attention on the dirty, smelly, destructive mining operations, saw as an alternative the squeaky clean, innovative, wonderful, hope for the future dot-com phenomena. So the mining companies found that the opportunities for financial support for their activities was being threatened and in some cases curtailed. So those factors came together simultaneously to leave, and by the way, at the same time, governments were responding with law, regulation, dealing with emission controls, effluent controls, land use, that was saying the companies were finding themselves, in terms of access to the land that they felt they needed to have to find the minerals that society needs, that was also being curtailed. So the land access was being curtailed, high level of public criticism of their activities, an investor community that was beginning to be very, very reticent, and they had to do something about that. Now, all of those things are not lined up right now. Of course, there's still criticism. I think the mining industry has moved significantly since then. There's still a long way to go, but they've moved. The investor community is very aware of social responsibility and is beginning to factor that into their equations. The companies themselves have gained the capacity to deal with it in a much more effective way. So times have changed. I don't think we're there yet, but times are very different now compared to what was going on when that young lady was caught in the photograph. And it went all over the New York Times. It was New York Times, if I remember correctly, and it was a shock because people's feelings were very strong.
So we went in the industry from kind of a position of reticence about adopting the language and the discourse of environmentalism and sustainability. But the industry had developed some early signs of moving into a more accommodation position. What were those green shoots that we started to see in the sector early on in its journey towards sustainable development?
Again, a really good question, because if you look back over the sequence of events, starting with Rachel Carson's book in 1963 and the evolution of the contemporary environmental movement, the rise of concern about post-World War II development of industry and associated pollution and concerns about that, the industry, more than reticence, the industry resisted.
A rejectionist position.
Utterly rejectionist, utterly defensive. And it was one of the things that had, quite frankly, had given the industry a real black eye, because others were recognizing the need to adjust how we were doing things. And the industry was essentially saying through the 70s, 80s, and most of the 90s, much of the 90s, was saying, listen, let us do what we do well, get stuff out of the ground, get it into society. Bugger off, don't talk to us about all this stuff about air and water and wildlife and parks and land and indigenous people and stuff. We're not interested in that. That's not our stuff. We want to just get on with what we're good at. As often happens, a few leading companies began to look at things in different ways. I mean, companies are, not all companies, but some companies are extremely aware of the fact that for their own success, they have to look in the future in a positive way. Like any group or community, there are leaders in that regard and there are laggards. And so too in the mining industry. The laggards would just carry on the way we're doing it. This don't bother me. But the leaders were beginning to see the change in societal values related to, amongst other things, the environment, related to gender, related to social justice issues, being concerned themselves about the nature of their influence on the communities around the sites and so forth. And you begin to see the early manifestations of that, actually going back to the 70s. The first mining company to adopt a formal environmental policy was in the early 70s, and that was Noranda, which was a Canadian company that, of course, eventually in due course was gobbled up to, it would be an early part of what is now Glencore, but it came through Falconbridge and Xstrata, now Glencore. But so the people of that company the board of that company established an environmental policy in the early 70s. That's very early. That company, as well as Placer Dome, published their first sustainability strategies in the mid 96, 97-ish era.
I think Western Mining was doing
Western
something
Mining
around
was
that
right
too.
in there also.
Yeah.
And, today people look back and it frustrates me that the industry itself doesn't recognize those early shoots, because we see in the literature the blah, blah, blah that's going on there about industry development, the sort of thing that gets talked about at the World Economic Forum in Davos. They talk about Walmart's policies that date from 2007. The industry was a decade, or even in some cases, the mining industry was a decade or even 2 decades ahead of all of that. So they were very aware, and I think it's because the mining industry is often at the margins, physically. They're in remote areas. They're dealing with extreme conditions environmentally and socially. They're being forced into dealing with issues in a way and earlier, in a more extreme way and earlier than many other industries. The manufacturing industry can locate itself in the suburbs of Brisbane.
It's part of the landscape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So without realizing, the mining industry has been pushed into a leadership position on many of these issues, and it's an interesting thing to me, because I don't think the mining industry itself realizes that it has found itself in a leadership position, having to deal with issues that are so current today.
In this crisis, the Global Mining Initiative formed, And this was a brainchild of Hugh Morgan, the CEO of Western Mining Corporation, took the concept to Sir Robert Wilson from Rio Tinto. They got on board a number of other CEOs like Doug Yearley from Placer Dome.
Phelps Dodge.
Phelps Dodge, sorry.
Yeah. And John Wilson from Placer Dome was one of the other people.
So these CEOs got together and they had a three-pronged process. It was to have the MMSD, the Mining Minerals and Sustainable Development Project, a global dialogue to engage on the topics, to have a conference, and then to change the International Council on Metals and the Environment into the International Council on Mining and Metals. At the time, they brought on board IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development, and Richard Sambrook to run the MMSD component, or to design the MMSD component. Luke Danielson was brought on board to lead, to deliver it, with Carolyn Digby and many others. The CEOs were kind of faced with a choice, though. They're faced with, because there was two camps in the industry, essentially. One was, we're under siege. Society just doesn't understand us and our benefits. What we need is a strong PR campaign to convince society of all the benefits that mining brings. The other camp was saying, guys, I think there's something more fundamental here. Maybe we need to actually look at some of the performance issues. We need to engage with the environmental and social challenges and criticism that's being levied with us.
And maybe we need to just do things a little bit differently.
Right. That's right. So there's a realization there's something meaningful there. Ultimately, it was the second group that won out, which is a kind of significant form of leadership that the industry was showing at that point. And you led the North America of the MMSD. You were the facilitator for North America. Tell us about the process. What happened during the MMSD? What was the outcomes of that process that was held?
So there was a global team that was based in London that Richard, you're right, Richard Sandbrook, really created in a way, and he brought on Luke Danielson and Caroline and others people to run the global team. And they crisscrossed the world over 2 years, engaging with people as best they could from all interests. In the meantime, they recognized that there were specific regional issues that had to be brought onto the table as well. And so there were regional teams created in South Africa, here in Australia, Latin America, and North America. Now, that didn't cover the whole world, but the pieces that were missing, the global team did the best they could to cover. So it had remarkable coverage. And there were, during the period of MMSD, conversations with interests of all sorts, not just the big companies, but small companies, the consultants, the indigenous people, the host communities, academics, the financial services industry, right across the world, about people's sense of the performance of the mining industry. And interestingly, they would be asked in the various conversations, what should the mining industry do differently? And that's a very, very key thing, because in posing the question, the companies who had sparked this and the chief executive officers who had the vision to do this, by asking the question, you're actually empowering someone else to participate through suggestion, to participate in the design of a long-term strategy. If you ignore what they say, you do it at your peril. So they are actually opening the door to a kind of power sharing that had never, ever, ever occurred before. And in that process, of which we handled the North American part, literally tens of thousands of people participated in that conversation. Out of it came an action plan. The ICMM, which I led for a period of time, was created to deliver that action plan. And it's interesting that the action plan came from that collaborative process. It wasn't simply the mining industry that was in a cupboard deciding what they were going to do. They shared, through that questioning, the opportunity for the action plan of ICMM to actually be designed by many people from across the world. In my view, that's one of the reasons that it's very powerful. And even to this day, the work program of ICMM is influenced by those early ideas. Now, obviously, many things have moved on. Yep. There were early major steps taken on some issues that were raised. It was not picked up by the mining industry for a variety of reasons. I think of one early on the question of artisanal mining came up, and the companies that were participants in the International Council for Mining and Metals, ICMM, said, well, we can't on our own deal with that and deliver improvements, so we're going to leave that for the moment. That's now beginning to come back and be very much a part of the action plan. Same on the issue of closure. Closure was suggested way back when as a very significant issue. It's only today that that's now risen. And I've come to understand that there is a time and a place, and you cannot do everything all of the time. And although those of us who had various pet issues back then felt, I think, disappointed when they maybe weren't picked up at that stage, I've learned that you plant a seed, and it doesn't disappear. And if an issue is an issue, maybe it can't be dealt with this year or next year, but a few years later it will come along, and its time will come. And I've seen that now happen, and indeed those are two good examples, the artisanal mining issue and the closure issue, which are now very much higher on the priority list of companies in ICMM and in other companies across the mining industry. I might add one thing that many people don't understand. The International Council of Mining and Metals has 24 companies on it now, I think that's the number. But there are 4,000 or 5,000 companies across the world. Now, many of them are much smaller, and the ICMM companies themselves, depending on the commodity, may be responsible for 50, 60, 70, even 80% of the commodities, certain commodities. But in terms of the industry writ large, there are many elements of the industry that are not formal members of the ICMM. So the ICMM operates, on the one hand, they want to do good things, and they hope that by demonstrating good practice, it will ripple out across the industry. And I think to some extent that's happened, and to a great extent it hasn't happened.
A big challenge during the implementation of MMSD, you had a big social movement, big environmental movements that had kind of pushed the industry into a situation of addressing environmentalism, sustainability for the first time. And they faced the question, do I become part of this MMSD? Do I sit out of the MMSD? Some chose to engage, some chose not to. Many of the most vocal civil society organisations that sat out, I've since spoken to some of their leaders, and they've said that they too now think that it was a meaningful process. But how did you, as North American kind of facilitator, handle that issue of the role of civil society in the process?
This is a wonderful question, because the reality is I spent many years deeply involved in civil society organizations.
Through Friends of the Earth,
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, and I understand that people of civil society want to bring positive change in the world according to their value set, and they will take decisions at any given time that, in their view, will enhance the opportunity for success for their strategy, and that can change over time as well. So in the case of MMSD North America, I was very involved, as were a number of other people, in active conversations with civil society organizations. Now, we would like to have had them at the table. We would like to have had them in the conversation every day, all of the time. And indeed, because of my time with Friends of the Earth Canada, I had experienced firsthand situations where civil society and industry sat down together, came to common ground, and actually created suggestions that government couldn't resist, because if industry and civil society come to common ground, it's very powerful in terms of serving as a change function. But at that time, many of the civil society organizations in North America were very hesitant and didn't trust. They had had many decades of seeing what they would judge as bad performance. Many of them had experiences where companies would say one thing and do another thing. So there was and similar, the companies, by the way, had experience of civil society organizations that were a little bit naughty, if it was sort of exaggerate for benefit according to their program, things that really they weren't lies, but they were maybe stretches. And so there was tremendous distrust that had to be overcome. Nevertheless, we could talk to all of the players and do the best we can to bring their influence into the process. So the final result in terms of the products of MMSD North America, even though the civil society organizations were not at the table in a formal
some
way,
were, but not all.
very few, yeah. Some of the more conservation oriented organizations did participate more actively. The more vocal advocacy organizations were from a conscious negotiating position, a bit more hands-off, but we were in conversation with them all the time. We were being influenced by them through one-on-one or small group discussions. So the final reports that came out, I certainly did, from my perspective, the best to see their concerns reflected in that. Now, were we entirely successful? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but we were, in spite of the lack of formal participation, we certainly tried to engage with them in a way that they would see their concerns reflected in what we wrote about. And I think we were, to some extent, successful in that.
The significance of MMSD. So the ICMM became a rather unique body as a peak organisation, really, that it's the peak industry association of the globe is set up around sustainability. There aren't too many industries where that happens. And as the president of that, you got to see the legacy of how MMSD played out. Now, in my conversations with industry leaders, with sustainability professionals in the sector, not a lot of them know about the MMSD. And so I guess I have a dual question. Do you think that the MMSD is appreciated for the significance that it had on the trajectory of the industry over the past almost 20 years? And what were the big things that changed in the sector? You alluded to it earlier. To my mind, that after the MMSD, immediately after you had the agreement, the partnership between the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and the ICMM on protected areas and not mining in protected areas. In your period of leadership, you also had free, prior, informed consent being something that was moved forward with Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, it was formally recognized for the very first time.
Right, but there was other issues like tailings that were a bit harder to grapple at. What's the legacy of the MMSD?
Well, let's take one back. In everything that I think about, there ends up being a substantive element like tailings and what I would call a process element, how to get there. And the first huge legacy of MMSD, I think, is a process phenomena in that it created in ICMM a very unusual organization whose mandate is to serve as a change agent. It's not, the mandate of ICMM is not simply to be a cheerleader for the industry. It is not to be a lobbyist for the industry. It is to be a change agent, to work with its members and others beyond to bring positive, constructive change to the industry. Because, going back to the point that you raised about those two communities, although there are gray areas between them to be fair, those two communities, one that was saying, the world doesn't understand, we therefore better tell our story better, and the other group saying, well, maybe there's some issues of how we do things that need to be adjusted to get people to understand things a little bit differently in terms of how our performance really is. Those two elements exist. ICMM was created, in a sense, very much in the image of the second element that is saying, maybe we've got to do things a little bit differently, and by doing differently, recognition of our story will come. That's very, very unusual. Now, since that time, there have been a few other industry mechanisms created. I think of the Aluminum Stewardship Project, or on the electronic side, there's an industry organization that's a little bit the same as that. Vast majority of industry associations are there to represent, to lobby for, to be a cheerleader of that particular industry it represents. Now, the ICMM will give credit where it's due, which I think is utterly fair. But fundamentally, it is there to change performance. So legacy, that's an extraordinary legacy that came out of the MMSD process to start with. Yes, in terms of substance, the protected areas decision early on to recognize the need for keeping mining out of certain protected areas in the world was a massive step, symbolically as well as substantively. It said that the mining industry was willing, for the first time, was willing to recognize that where values clashed, in some cases, the dominant value of industry, which was to have the right to get material out of the ground and feed it through efficient production into society, could perhaps be overcome or resisted through a value that said, in this particular areas, the importance of the ecosystem, or somewhere else it might be some social condition, is more significant to the world writ large than just getting stuff out of the ground. So that was very, very important early on. I think the FPIC decision was very significant. We're still working out, the world is still working out what that really means. But the step that was taken at that time was that the ICMM companies said, yes, this is real. Communities have to be part of the decision-making process, and we commit to bringing them into those decision-making processes. And I think that's very, very important. And there have been, I forgot the number of statements like that ICMM has come up with over the years, but some have been very symbolic and very, very important. I think that there may be some areas that we have yet to really deal with effectively.
In the book that I published in 2015, Mountain Movers, I called for some serious effort to be put into thinking about what an MMSD plus 20 would look like. And in the program that I'm leading here at the Sustainable Minerals Institute, the Governance and Leadership in Mining program, we're kind of looking at a proof of concept of what that could mean. It's obviously not going to look the same as it did before, if it does proceed. Paolo de Sa, the former practice leader for mining and energy at the World Bank, recently said on Raw Talks that mining is ripe for another MMSD moment. What's your view on that topic? Is mining ripe for that moment? Is there appetite in civil society for it? Is there a role that government can play? Because it wasn't as strong a player in the last MMSD as it probably should have been. What would it look like if it does happen now? What would be different?
Oh, this is a great question. And yeah, you're right. The government was more of a spectator at that time, although we tried to engage with government people. They were obviously caught in the crossfire in a lot of cases where there is a fight going on between a mining operation and a community. The government is caught in the middle. Since that time, they have created the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining and Sustainable Development, Mining, Minerals and Metals and Sustainable Development. That has grown to being a very, very active, very successful organization at this stage in terms of bringing countries from across the world together to deal with important issues.
400 people last year. It's
Yeah,
really
that's right.
grown. Yeah.
Very, very big. So that's a big success story, which is terrific. In my view, it's funny, we had a conversation earlier today with a person on a very technical issue, talking about optimizing systems. And we came to the conclusion that the key link is learning about what has occurred, drawing lessons, and feeding it back into the system. In a way, MMSD created a baseline. Now it is time to look at the system, assess performance, and really come to grips with what we've done well, what still needs work, how do we make more change, and feed that into the system. So it's the feedback loop. And so it's very different than the starting point, which is MMSD, which is the baseline. We did the baseline. Now the question is, how do you assess the performance of the industry in the 20-year interim period? What more how can we say about that? And you know, and I wrote recently about this, there is not an accepted way of assessing the performance of the mining industry across the world. We don't have that. We have concerns. We have a situation here where a company is doing very, very well, or a situation there where it's not doing very, very well. But writ large across the world, is the industry achieving the kind of constructive role in society that people had aspirations for at the time of MMSD. We need to look at that question very, very profoundly.
Tony Hodge, thank you for your time today. Very much appreciated. And from all of us here at the Sustainable Minerals Institute, thank you for the energy, the insights, the experience, the gravitas that you've brought to your residency.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Daniel.